Captain Rombach, who commanded our company, was still a very young man. He took command in the autumn of 1940 when we were stationed near Paris. At first he frightened us a little with his behaviour, portraying himself as a picky boss, but it soon became clear that he was quite a good medical officer. He knew the pros and cons of the organisation very well. In addition, he was a good horseman and played scat very well. In an army made up of energetic and determined men, you have to be tough and put yourself in a position to be reckoned with in terms of material distribution. This was very characteristic of the Wehrmacht during the Second World War, especially when people were asked what they wanted to get. Fortunately, Captain Rombach had an uncanny ability to ensure that the operations team had the most favourable environment in which to work. Of particular importance in some cases, Rombach always solved our problems in the face of even the most unthinkable difficulties. Most important of all was the fact that he knew something about the plans of the command, so we had no reason to constantly worry that we might fall into the hands of the Russians. Very often we carried out operations to the last possible opportunity and always managed to evacuate in time. But at that moment we had completely different concerns. We were filled with ambition. There was a certain amount of competition between the two medical companies of the division, since mobility and speed were important in our case. It is understandable that at first the motorized company had some advantages over us, but as soon as the thaw came, our horses proved to be more adapted to it than the vehicles, which stuck in the mud. We obtained permission from our not at all stupid divisional medical chief to join one of the infantry regiments and open a field surgical hospital wherever we ourselves deemed necessary, without asking for further permission. Colonel Reinhardt, the regimental commander to whom we made the request, was an old soldier who had been through the First World War. In the new Wehrmacht, those who had volunteered for the army in 1914 and who had a bad experience of the World War under their belt formed a special brotherhood. They greeted each other with a somewhat old-fashioned and unfailing politeness. They knew they could rely on each other in any circumstance. They always tried to help each other. They understood perfectly well what it meant to fight a war on two fronts. They also knew very well that initial major victories in individual battles did not guarantee victory in the war. And besides, they knew that somewhere in the shadows lurked the others, who, just as they had done earlier in France, where they only got in after the army had brought order there, began to trample the ancient traditions of Europe with their shod boots. These old soldiers, who had been the heroes of the battles of Verdun and the Somme when they were still penniless youths, were now mature, confident men trying to follow civilized traditions of warfare. The young soldiers were more skeptical in this respect, and for that reason were more relaxed. But their boldness was more like fanaticism than valor. It was only when we began to realize the utter senselessness of this war, the thought of which, as the years passed, slowly affected the army like a thrombosis to the human organism, and above all to the head, that we gradually began to realize that we were doomed. We made a sort of gentleman's agreement with the senior staff officer of our division. He immediately realized all the advantages of having a medical company close to the positions of the combat units. For this reason, he authorized us to call on him at any time to obtain accurate information, not only on the current situation, but also on the designs of the High Command. This was a valuable privilege, as the time for making the right decisions was usually limited. With our slow speed of movement, the loss of every hour meant that we would be constantly 3 or 4 kilometers behind the forward units. Without direct communication with division headquarters, we would be operating at half our capabilities. Now we had a direct link with the forward combat units. We ourselves were just a military unit. There was a certain difference between these concepts, and only after several years we managed to achieve that in the documents for our unit was fixed the definition of combat. We always defended our rights in front of the Corps' medical superiors. Specifically for our company, this meant additional supplies of oil, cigarettes, and alcohol, and in addition we were given an additional quota for awards. We entered the village at dawn and unharnessed our tired horses to feed and water them. We encamped in one of the farmyards closest to the enemy positions. There was also some possibility that this was the place where we would open a field surgical hospital. We did not yet know if an offensive was planned. We could hear machine gun bursts coming from a small wood about 600 meters away, so the front line was not far away at all. At that period of the war, it didn't matter much. Usually the Russians would retreat closer to nightfall. At dawn they would simulate some activity, which would be produced by a few small groups left for that purpose, and then they too would disappear in the morning mist. Gradually this led to carelessness, and the vehicles along the village street were parked in chaotic disorder. Small groups of soldiers followed past. In spite of the early hour, they already looked tired. Their uniforms were covered with dust and soaked with sweat. Their faces were weary and listless. They were laden with weapons and dragged small mortars behind them on wagons. Captain Rombach and I sat leaning against the wall of the hut and enjoyed the first warmth of the rising sun. In an hour it would be scorching mercilessly. Suddenly some movement became visible to the east of the farmyard. A man was walking slowly through a field of sunflowers between the forest, where the machine gun bursts were coming from, and the farmyard. He was dressed in a military uniform, but he had no weapon. Russian. As he wandered through a field of sunflowers that swayed on their tall stems, they parted before him like the surface of the sea before the prow of a ship. Someone grabbed a rifle leaning against the wall and pulled the bolt. Then he suddenly remembered that it was not loaded. Everyone started laughing. "Now you can't get the Iron Cross?" "Marchesins. Site 200. You just got back from a whirl, eh, soldier?" His girlfriend must have had a baby. The Order of the Fatherhood with oak leaves and swords. In unison they began to hum an old song. 3 cheers, 3 cheers, 3 cheers for the Senator Neman. Who long ago? Meanwhile, the Russian came very close to us. He probably thought we were crazy. For a man who wants to escape from his own to the enemy, the time it takes seems endless. He is between two fires. At any moment anger may shoot at him from behind or distrust from the front. The Russian entered the gate. He was probably about 19 years of age. He was very handsome, tall, wiry, with a broad Slavic face, and with hair of the ash-grey colour so characteristic of the Siberians. He looked round fearfully. We were all laughing, so he gave a thin, expectant smile. Such a smile usually means that a life has been saved. Someone patted him on the shoulder and said, "All right, Ivan, relax." The Russian laughed loudly, exposing his magnificent teeth. Then he turned round and saw a bucket that was 1/3 full of water. He grasped it with both hands and put it to his lips as if it were a goblet. Never in my life had I seen a man drink so much liquid in such a short period of time. He had probably been feeling thirsty for many days. The cook immediately engaged the Russian to work in the kitchen, primarily peeling potatoes. He stayed with us for 4 years. He became one of the first out of probably millions of Russian soldiers to go into service with the Germans. He loved it in the kitchen. When we were convinced of this after a week, we didn't have the heart to send him anywhere. Shortly after the events described, a traffic controller appeared. He reported that 3 wounded Russians were lying at the far end of the village street, where it turns north. I went there. 2 of them were wounded lightly, but the 3rd had lost a lot of blood, having been shot in the back. As I bent over him, cars full of infantry were whizzing along the dusty village street behind me. I listened to the lung on the side where the wound was, but could not determine anything. When I turned the wounded man over on his other side, I immediately noticed blood flowing in thin, bright rivulets from the wound, probably from one of the arteries running under the lower ribs. I applied the lotion directly on top of the wounded man's buttoned uniform. When I stood up, I saw the division commander standing beside me. As my hands were stained with blood, I did not salute him, but as it seemed extremely strange to the general that he was not saluted, he asked me with a mixed feeling of embarrassment and curiosity, but quite polite, my sweet, "Why did you not salute?" I showed him my blood-stained hands. I saw that he gloomed. "Are you wounded?" "Reggie, it is not my blood. It is the blood of the Russian who lies here. I was just dressing him." 2 lightly wounded Russians were sitting near the wall with their legs bent at the knees. They were listening suspiciously to our conversation. They probably surmised that the important Mr. General was discussing whether they should be shot or not. And the 3rd Russian was lying right beside the road. The wheels of passing cars were almost hitting him. He could have been run over at any moment. The general looked at him strangely. He said, "Hey, I will order a sentry to be placed near you. He'll make sure nothing happens to this Russian wounded man. You want him out of here, don't you?" "Yes, Mr. General." We couldn't explain anything to this wounded man, even in Russian. He was a Mongol who had his yurt and camels taken from him somewhere in the Gobi Desert and sent to this war. It happened that he was wounded by a bullet that lodged in his ribs. The lung was intact. We removed the piece of rib that had broken off, sutured the damaged artery and sewed up the wound. We only did a few hours a day. The losses were small. Timoshenko did not offer any resistance. At noon, the commander ordered me to establish contact with Colonel Reinhardt. I found him on a hillock overgrown with bushes, with white blossoming flowers, and filled with the humming of bumblebees. A country road led west from it. A machine gun was mounted on the top of the cliff, and we were standing right out in the open. Just at this time, a hot meal was delivered to the officers of the headquarters. The officer on duty. Because he spoke with a pronounced Berlin accent, he was usually referred to as the capital sharpener, greeted me with great enthusiasm. "They're running. They're running." We gave Timoshenko a strong kick. He softened like butter in the sun. Now we have the Dnieper in front of us. Then there will be the Don. Then the Volga. The regimental band has included in its repertoire a song about shuttles sailing down the Volga. Naturally, you've heard of the Urals, haven't you, Doctor? It's a nice place, isn't it? Here's life. Here's life. And he started dancing. The colonel asked me to stay with them for breakfast, after which we smoked a cigarette and drank coffee. I had an opportunity of thanking him for his hospitality by treating him to some good vodka, which I kept in a flask. The capital Ostroslov made a toast. Long live the medical service. Then he had to go to the location of one of the battalions. The colonel and I sat in the shade of the bushes. Everything was calm. We had a lot of free time in reserve. Directly above us, a large bird was circling between the white piles of clouds and the blue sky in search of prey. The bright sunshine, the fragrance of flowers, the smell of the earth, the buzzing of bees. It was one of those brief and memorable moments that soldiers rarely have in the heat of war. A tiny bug was crawling on my arm. Its black wings glistened in the sun like gold. I didn't touch it, though it tickled quite a bit. The colonel was watching the whole scene. I looked at him, and we had the same thought at the same time. The next time bugs crawl all over us, will it be as ticklish? We both laughed and were slightly embarrassed. The moment passed. I threw the bug off me. We both survived the war. For many weeks we moved forward from dawn to dusk across the vast fields of the Ukraine, from which the rich harvest had never been harvested. At night we usually slept in the open air. It was easier, and we had an extra hour to sleep. We slept on straw bedding under a sky full of bright stars. Sometimes we were awakened by the cold, and sometimes by the snorting of a horse that had managed to get loose and was beginning to nibble at the straw. The kitchen staff had been preparing coffee and breakfast since midnight, so that we would have time to eat at dawn before setting off. The pace of the advance was rapid. It almost never came to fighting, so we had little or no work to do. The horses had become so skinny that you could count all their ribs. All of us also lost a lot of weight and were very tired, but Timoshenko was running even faster. We had crossed the Bug and had already reached the Dnieper. Wide and full-flowing, these two rivers flow through the southern part of Russia and flow into the Black Sea. It was from the shores of the Black Sea that Jason brought the Golden Fleece. Iphigenia travelled through the dark waters of the Prontida towards the land prepared for her. The Greeks founded their cities on its shores. The remains of Olbia, located at the mouth of the Bug, rise slightly above the water and may one day become an archaeological treasure trove like Herculaneum and Pompeii. On the opposite side of the Black Sea, near Trebizond, the journey of the Greeks, described in Xenophonte's Anabasis, ended. On the shores of Pontus, Euguge ruled Mithridates v. Eupator. Until he was defeated by Pompey, Rome had no more dangerous opponent after Hannibal. Here the exiled Ovid mourned for laurels, feasts and friends left behind in distant Rome. The name Ovidiopolis serves as a reminder of his exile. Here Scythians and Sarmatians met in battles, of which there is little or no evidence in historical sources. There is also the fortress of Oshakov, near which Baron Munchausen flew a cannonball during the Russo-Turkish Wars. Here Armand du Plessis, Count de Richelieu, at the request of Alexander I, built a completely new city in the classical Russian style. From the pedestal of his monument, he looks down on the famous 200 steps leading to the harbour. There the revolution took place in 1905. Near Nikolaev, where we crossed the Bug, we found the first evidence that Timoshenko had begun to retreat even more hastily. In the fields spread along the river stood thousands of combine harvesters, widely used in Ukrainian collective farms. The Russians were forced to simply abandon them. We were stationed in a village north of Nikolaev, or west of the Bug. There were few wounded, and those that came to us had been wounded during the storming of the fortress of Oshakov. We received an order that all units in the area should assist the local agriculture. Our village was part of a collective farm that owned about 15,000 acres of land. The first thing we had to do was to use horses to remove combines abandoned along the river near Nikolaev. Then we persuaded the peasants to complete the harvest, which had been interrupted by the war. The peasants soon asked us to provide them with grain reserves for the winter. Peasant thinking is characterized by concretus. They feared that in the atmosphere of general confusion their needs would simply be forgotten. Under Soviet rule, each member of a peasant family was entitled to 7 poods of wheat, about 250 pounds. At that time we considered ourselves liberators, and we allocated 15 poods per person. The next problem was salt. Peasants were going somewhere in search of it. Most of us heard for the first time that cattle could not live without salt. But where could we find it? Where did Sambo disappear to? Sambo was equipped with a huge collection of all sorts of passes and passwords. If the security service arrested him outside his unit's location, and Sambo claimed he was looking for salt for the peasants, we would probably never see him again. But a few weeks later we would get a notice that he had been arrested for a wool. 2 days later he returned. He found a salt works on the coast, and there this precious commodity lay in whole heaps. This news made a strong impression on the peasants, and they began to feel a sense of confidence in us. Regularly, at intervals of a few days, we held meetings on the stone steps of the church, during which the peasants could present their requests or complaints. Litigation was also presented to us for our consideration. For example, a woman returned to the village to regain possession of her house. Her husband had been arrested by the NKVD and shot without trial or judgment. Their house was confiscated. Another peasant bought it and paid 100 rubles for it. The first thing we announced was that executions without trial and confiscation were illegal. The widow's demand for the return of her house was recognized as justified. The assembled people met this decision with an approving roar. But the peasant who had bought the house insisted that he had acquired it legally. No doubt he was right. A clear embarrassment. What were we to do? The peasants looked at me expectantly. I looked at Herman and realized that an idea had struck him. He put his hand into his pocket, took out a banknote of 100 marks, gave it to the peasant and said, "This is compensation from the funds of our company." Everyone laughed. Justice had been restored. Then we proceeded to distribute the cows to the peasants. For the first time they became their personal property. It was already an achievement. An old peasant woman stood before me. Thanks to the sun and the wind, the skin of her face was brown and wrinkled with thousands of wrinkles. A pair of clear, penetrating and friendly eyes looked at me. She must have been in her 70s. Her skirt still bore traces of the embroidered patterns once characteristic of the national costume of this marvelous country. I heard that she knew as many folk tales as I could count the wrinkles on her face. Never, even in royal times, did she have more wealth than one goat. We gave her a cow. Her face brightened up. She looked at her cow, carefully felt its udder. Then she nodded gratefully and beckoned the little boy over to her. He looked to be no more than 4 years old, but like a grown-up peasant. He grabbed the cow by the leash and led her away. It was such a hilarious picture that even the elderly peasants with long beards began to smile and mutter approvingly. The contented old woman started talking and told me that she was raising 3 grandchildren alone. Their father had been arrested and their mother, who, gone in search of him, had disappeared without a trace. Here she stands before me, the embodiment of Mother Russia, bent under the weight of years and life's trials, but with a burning heart and an unshakable faith in the ultimate justice. She bade farewell to Mr. Commander with easy grace and concluded by saying, "Oh, God bless your Excellency." The peasants again expressed their approval. The next day we buried a junior lieutenant who was only 17 years old. He was wounded in the chest. I remembered him very well. He was one of those patients who soon realized that there was nothing we could do to help him. When we lifted the sheet under which the body lay to take his papers and valuables, we saw before us a beautiful face with finely chiseled features, as beautiful as the faces of the young men on the Greek stelae. The whole village took part in the funeral. The women mourned for the young man as if he were their own son. Colonel Reinhardt also came. He felt very sorry for the lad. While the captain was speaking, we stood in formation in our steel helmets under the blazing sun, surrounded by grieving women, tears streaming down their cheeks. When the farewell salute sounded, there was panic among the peasants. They were unfamiliar with such a custom, but we calmed them down. On the grave they placed bunches of flowers picked from their own gardens and then solemnly promised us that they would always look after the grave. After the funeral ceremony was over, I told the colonel about our policy towards the local population. He smiled skeptically. He knew a lot of things I didn't already know. On the eve of the capture of the fortress of Oshakov, we were visited by a charming cavalry captain who had served in the Guards Field Artillery Regiment under the Kaiser. As a young lieutenant, he had caught the best days of the Second German Empire. He was in our division for 3 weeks and was often our guest, but we never asked him what position in the division he held. "We must go, my dear doctor, we must go. My sincerest thanks for your hospitality. Are you going to leave? But tomorrow we must storm the fortress. Will you also take part in that?" "Alas, it is impossible, but I will be there." "Impossible? My holiday is coming to an end." "Your holiday?" "Yeah, I command one of those damned useless batteries on the Dutch coast. I've been granted leave. I'm a bachelor. What was I supposed to do? All my friends are in the army. That's why I came here to see the war in Russia with my own eyes. And just today my leave ends." Naturally, we did our best to give this descendant of Don Quixote a proper farewell feast. Soon afterwards we were transferred to Nikolaev. During the 2 autumn weeks that we spent in Nikolaev, we did nothing, but simply ate and slept. But suddenly events occurred that snapped us out of our state of mental and physical relaxation, and with such fury that it deprived us of peace of mind forever. In 1934, an intelligent and decent soldier who had been through the First World War, on entering the new Wehrmacht in his former rank, joining the army is the easiest way to emigrate. This was a great misconception. In Nikolaev, all Soviet citizens of Jewish nationality were subjected to registration, driven behind barbed wire, shot, and then buried in an anti-tank ditch by a team of others. We had heard vague rumors about this, which we did not want to believe at first, but eventually we had to believe. An officer from the army headquarters photographed the whole scene, and as a result was dismissed from the staff. We waited for further developments. At that time, we did not want to believe that the army commander did not have enough power to prohibit such atrocities in his area of responsibility. A few days later, the reconnaissance aircraft of the Colonel General, when landing, hit a mine too. Storch was blown to pieces. During the funeral of the new commander, fell into an open grave. In the minds of the troops, these 2 events merged into an ominous omen. No further action was taken regarding the investigation of the shooting of the inhabitants of Nikolaev. No doubt there was a widespread feeling of protest in the troops against the killing of innocent people. Any soldier felt it was unfair that others were allowed to exploit for their own ends the successes the army had achieved through hard and brutal fighting. But there were no open expressions of outrage. The virus of anti-Semitism was already deeply rooted in the souls of the people. The disapproving reaction of the combat units to such crimes did not prevent further killings, but simply forced their direct perpetrators to act more covertly. There were no furious protests. The heat was smouldering too deep in the wood. After 7 years of domination by others, moral decay had touched even the souls of those people who had initially resisted it all. Each person on his own was powerless, not only because he was in danger if he spoke out against such atrocities. Many had already experienced them. Repression could touch the family as well. A letter in which a colonel from our division expressed to his wife his attitude to such things fell into the hands of the censor. His wife was arrested. Their emotional rejection was also complicated by the fact that the Russians themselves were committing similar atrocities. Our forward units were finding whole mountains of corpses in German villages along the banks of the Bug. The Soviet authorities wanted to evacuate their inhabitants, Soviet citizens of German nationality, but the rapid advance of our troops left them no time for this, and these unfortunate people were simply shot. During the battle for Nikolaev, many Jews who guessed what awaited them if the city was captured took part in the street battles as volunteers. An attempt was made to justify the execution of Jews in Nikolaev by claiming that it was a legitimate repression. The opponents cost each other in many ways and tried not to concede to each other. Each of them tried to justify their own atrocities by claiming that the opponent was committing the same atrocities. Each claimed to have the right to revenge. In fact, none of them had such a right. A German soldier stood between them. The great delusion which had been dispelled was later replaced by an even more absurd delusion. Once the army was victorious, it would be in a position to stop these atrocities. This latter delusion was not brought in from outside, as it may now appear. After the campaign in France was over, the others immediately left the scene. But they lurked in the shadows. A criminal will never be the equal of a decent man who tries to play by the rules. The second blow fell upon us almost immediately. The commander of an anti-tank battalion that was part of the division shot himself. He was a friend of mine. He had been decorated several times during World War I, and during World War II I had distinguished himself in campaigns in France, Greece, and Russia. In the 10 years I spent in the war, I met very few people who were virtually devoid of a sense of fear. He was one of them. He loved danger. He was fearless. He could plan operations perfectly and was tirelessly concerned for the welfare of his men. It once happened that he asked his friends in Bucharest for a loan of Romanian money and returned it in German money. This was considered a currency transaction. From a formal point of view, the soldier was on foreign territory. However, such an exchange looked simply ridiculous. Probably this whole story could have ended even without a disciplinary penalty, which the division commander, who in this case was the highest court, could impose. But there was another circumstance. For several months, a lieutenant who served in the headquarters of the unit commanded by my friend had been recording the major's remarks about the Nazi regime. The lieutenant sent his notes to one of the highest party leaders in Germany, and they came back to the division through official channels. The major was threatened with demotion and sent to a punitive unit as a private. He was already 45 years old and had lived his life honestly. So he decided to shoot himself. According to the rules during the funeral, such persons were forbidden to give military honours. Moreover, even the chaplain was not allowed to make speeches at the grave. The general, however, gave generous permission to hold an honourable funeral. One man who had served as chief of the medical section in the unit, the major commanded, and who owed him much, refused to attend the funeral. He belonged, as we suddenly learnt, to the others. The system of whistleblowing had entangled the army. The man who somewhat later perfected this system was wounded during an assassination attempt on 20 July and died of his wounds. The grave was located in a secluded spot on top of one of the hills near the mouth of the Bug. Soldiers from an anti-tank unit placed a stone stele on the grave, which they had found far from the site, and decorated it with a tombstone epitaph. Further down the river, the ruins of Olbia, an ancient Greek city, were visible. The winds that blew over the tomb came from the banks of the Volga or from the coast of Asia Minor. They brought with them the rich flavour of the steppe or the distant salty taste of the sea. Under this stone lie not just the mortal remains of an old soldier. Here also lie courage and nobility. Geographers have drawn a conventional line stretching from the northeastern corner of the Caspian Sea along the Ural River to the southern end of the Ural Mountains and called it the border between Europe and Asia. But this boundary runs also in the souls of men. Peter the Great was a European. Vladimir Leonov was an Asian. The wind that brings rain to the Nogai steppe comes from Asia. This wind blows from the sea, the wind that inflates the sails, whips up great waves and hurls them against the deserted shore. This wind blows for many weeks. This wind blows the soul out of the body. Its emptiness defies description. It is difficult for a man who has never seen it to imagine it. Only balls of dried grass roll over it, chasing each other relentlessly across the brown, sun-scorched earth, which in spring was a sea of flowers. The steppe balls have a rounded shape. They are grass clumps torn from the ground from the roots. Tumbleweeds nut run for hundreds of kilometers across the desert spaces in inconceivable zigzags, sometimes in groups, sometimes singly, and then again in groups, like players in some monstrous and inconceivable game. Even this land, the land of exiles and prisoners, is not completely forgotten by God. Later, in November, before the snow fell, a miracle happened. One morning the whole steppe turned green. Fresh grass was sprouting. If you take a walk on this hard ground, you can find here and there green spots. All other colours disappear like water before Tantalus. Look round, however, and turn your inquisitive eye to the skyline, which gleams like an emerald, the most precious of all gems. It is for this discreet beauty, for this feeling of infinite space and eternal simplicity, for all this that we fell in love with the steppe during those few years we spent in it. And when we parted with it, we felt a sense of longing even for the steppe winds. On the topographic maps showing Perikop, the isthmus connecting the Crimean Peninsula with the mainland, the height differences are so insignificant that they are given in centimetres, Between Savash and the Black Sea, the heights are only a few meters above sea level. The isthmus is crossed by a large ditch, part of the defense system that the Tatars built in the early 18th century when the Russians drove them back into the Crimea. The earthen fortifications, 15 to 20 meters high, rise above a moat about 10 meters deep. Even after 200 years, these fortifications are a serious enough obstacle that tanks cannot overcome and eventually have to be stormed by infantry. During the siege of Odessa, I was sent there on a business trip for a few weeks. When in November I rejoined my company, which was then stationed in a village north of the Tatar rampart, I was soon directly confronted with the changes in the tactics of our troops which had taken place that summer. I was transported back in a very maneuverable vehicle, which had excellent cross-country capability, the Kubel. It was a convertible vehicle with a very efficient four-wheel drive, the German equivalent of a Jeep. The division command placed it at my complete disposal for the time I was away. During the journey from Odessa through Nikolaev and Kherson, I suffered greatly from the cold. The weather was overcast and rainy. We had to stop many times to pull other vehicles out of the mud, and it was late evening when we arrived at our destination. It was overcast, and we had to drive with our headlights on. When we finally reached the village and switched off the engine, we heard a piercing and quite unusual roar beside us. My chauffeur immediately switched off the headlights. They might have attracted attention to us. It was pitch darkness, not even the moon was peeping through the clouds. I heard the noise of a plane flying, and at the same moment I heard the sound of falling bombs. We threw ourselves right into the mud. Explosions were heard all around, clods of earth fell on us, and then everything went quiet. No doubt the light from our headlights had attracted the enemy's attention. In the dead silence that always follows a raid, I distinctly heard the pitiful, appealing cries of the wounded in which fear and despair were audible, but no movement was visible. It was not quite clear how it could happen that the bombs fell into the very midst of the frightened and defenseless people without doing much harm. Suddenly someone started screaming again, just a few meters away from. "Idiots! What are you thinking? You should all be shot." I recognized the voice of my company commander. It was coming from somewhere to my right. In the pitch darkness I reported my arrival to him, and it sounded so ridiculous that we both started laughing loudly. Then we held out our mud-stained hands to each other. Naturally, he was also crawling on the ground. The first thing I was told was that the next morning we would have to redeploy to new positions, which meant that in a few hours I would have to set off again to find a suitable place for a field surgical hospital. Rombach had been expecting me for several days. We were delighted to meet each other after a long separation, and the circumstances of our arrival were so dramatic that they provided an additional reason to make a celebration. A bottle of vodka had been prepared especially for my return, and we decided to empty it at once. It was probably wise to get a few hours' sleep, but there would be a battle tomorrow, and by the next evening we might not be alive. The only way to remain calm under such circumstances is to have inner self-control, to demonstrate what the ancients called virtus, and also to demonstrate a certain style of behavior peculiar to a dandy, savoir vivre or savoir mourir. So, for example, Stendhal prided himself on shaving every day during the retreat from Moscow in 1812. Probably the sensible thing to do would have been to go to bed to get some rest before the battle. But to spend such a night talking and drinking is the ultimate chick. It gives human interactions an extra and special poignancy. Like Alexander's soldiers, who on the eve of the decisive battle with Darius that ended the great empire, sat around campfires on the issues and talked about the sunrise over the Acropolis in Athens, about the vineyards on the hills of Attica, and about the women they had left behind on the shores of the Aegean. In the same way, we sat around a hot iron cooker and talked about the sunrise over the Hevelseen, a group of lakes in the neighborhood of Berlin, about the beer gardens near the Oranienburg Gate, and about the girls listening to the brass band in the city park in Treptow. But there was also a significant difference between us. Any river we crossed could be considered the Galis, and the empire we destroyed was created by our own fathers. Everyone had some vague premonitions about it. We tried not to talk about it, but a certain tension was always felt, and the longer the war went on, it became stronger and stronger. At times we just tried not to show it and tried to keep up our reputation as brave soldiers. At that time, it was customary for us to listen to Lily Marlene every night. As soon as the last verse was played, some more bombs fell near us, and we listened to the end of the song lying under the table. all about the business, which had got fat again since they had been fed oats. That Pani, the consummate jumper, had colic, and that Sergeant Garloff had led her round in circles on a lead all night until the colic had passed. Then a whole batch of very handsome Bulgarian medals were taken out, and their distribution was accompanied by jokes and lively conversation. Colonel Reinhardt led the party, and in a state of alcoholic intoxication declared that the medical company would henceforth be the 15th company of his regiment. I spoke of the bravery shown by the Romanian soldiers during the fighting for Odessa, and of the hospitality of their officers, and told the comical story that the storming of the city had been scheduled for the day after the Russians themselves had abandoned it. I told of the sights of Odessa, the famous staircase, the monument to Duke Richelieu, and the enormous booty captured in the harbour. Then the conversation turned smoothly to a discussion of the coming battle. Some parts of our division had already entered the battle, and strange rumours were reaching us from the front. The Russians were no longer fleeing, but fighting with such fierceness as if the devil himself had got into them. Ours had been forced to burrow into the ground. The terrain was absolutely flat, and the whole was under Russian fire to such a depth that the horses had to be hidden in shelters, otherwise they would simply be shot over. The trenches were filled with groundwater. The casualty rate was said to be very high. There were serious doubts as to whether our troops could break through the isthmus at all, and the prospect of doing an enormous number of operations in damp and cold for many days and nights loomed up before us. Suddenly the east door opened, and a wind from the steppe blew in a lamp. In the dim light from the cooker, which illuminated only the lower part of our faces, we looked like participants in some medieval mystery. The stableman came in and reported that the horses were saddled. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. We finished our vodka and, having collected our dressing gowns, gloves, revolver holsters, clipboards and gas masks, left the room. The stable boys pulled off the horses' blankets. We climbed into the saddles and rode forward into the night gloom. It stopped raining, and when we turned round we saw that the furnace, like the eye of a cyclops, was still glowing in the darkness. That village on the Perikop Isthmus, which I had left at 3 a.m. This morning lay a few kilometres west of the country road, and it was to this that we were to reach. I took Sergeant Garloff with me. He was a dry, taciturn, reliable man who had grown up on a horse farm in Pomerania. He had spent all his life among horses, and over the years his face had become something like a horse's face, which is sometimes the case with men of his profession. He was a first-class horseman, practically being one with his riding horse, whose name was Napoleon. In the first days after the outbreak of war, on one of the open plains near the Prut, a Russian fighter on a reconnaissance flight hunted us. In search of rescue, we galloped straight towards the aircraft and jumped out of its range just before it was supposed to open machine gun fire on us, according to our calculations. We repeated this maneuver until we were safe. If he had been an Englishman, he might simply have done a circle of honour over us and waved goodbye with his wings. But he was a Russian and could afford no liberties. We galloped side by side in the silence of the night, seeing almost nothing around us in the pitch darkness. Garloff suddenly pulled at Napoleon's reins. The horse crouched on its hind legs and stopped. I also pulled on the reins. My first thought was that Napoleon had one of his legs caught in a hair hole, but Garloff jumped off his horse, took a few steps forward and disappeared into the darkness. My horse Pani was anxiously chewing something. When Garloff reappeared, he uttered but one word: mines. I remembered that there were Russian positions nearby. With his keen eyes, Garloff was able to spot a small piece of white cloth attached to a wire a few centimetres above the ground. This is usually how the boundaries of a minefield are marked. I also dismounted, and, leading the horses, we walked along the white cloth wire. It stretched just along the road, on which only a few rows of vehicles could move at a time. There was no need to make a big diversions. However, minefields were not placed individually, and it was not certain that they had all been located and labelled accordingly. We peered intently into the darkness stretching out before us. The grave sites had probably already been marked out for us on the strip of land that stretched between us and the country road. Of course, it would be best to move forward on foot, but perhaps there are no minefields further on. Overcautiousness sometimes has the opposite effect and causes people to act irrationally. Heavy lumps of clay stuck to our boots as we walked along with our horses for several hundred meters. Step by step, we had to pull our feet out of the impenetrable mud. An experienced soldier is always wary, but at times caution can lead to the same result as the prediction of the Delphic oracle. by following which a man gets into more trouble than the one he was endeavouring to avoid. If we continue on foot, we will lose half an hour. The loss of half an hour under the protective cover of night might result in our being bombed on a congested road. The fatalism of the experienced soldier is based on the knowledge that the future is unpredictable. So, Garloff, what do you make of all this? We just barely got out of one dangerous situation. Why should we push our luck again? At that very time, Napoleon, the old warhorse, raised his head and roared happily. Pani answered him. In the east, the first glimmer of dawn was dawning. It was a sign from God. The fear of resting here forever left us. We decided to walk, though it was not easy, as we had to scrape the mud off our boots with our hands. After half an hour, we reached the road. When you see one of those roads on which reinforcements move to the front line, the time-honoured phrase "the army makes its way" accurately reflects what is happening. Every soldier, every horse, every vehicle has been counted twice, once at army headquarters and once here in the mud. In the headquarters there is always peace and quiet. Here there is complete chaos. The units are stretched out over many kilometres. No one can stop a new unit, which, on the left or right side, flows into the small gap formed between the moving columns. The so-called road is an ordinary path, on which only light carts of Ukrainian peasants could drive. It was hastily reinforced with gravel and fragments of stones. Stones are very rare in the steppe. For many hours the army reinforcements tire the peasant path. Another inconvenience must be added to this. Ditches have been dug along the roadsides, making it impossible to bypass the jam in the fields. The rear wheel of one of the horse-drawn wagons, which is moving as part of a column stretching for many kilometres, falls into a deep shell crater filled with water. The wheel breaks. The axle of the wagon flies upwards. Horses rush forward. One of the reins breaks. The wagon following behind tries to go round to the left, but cannot get out of the deep route. The right rear wheel of the second cart clings to the left rear wheel of the first cart. The horses roar and start thrashing about in all directions. The way forward and back is closed. A lorry, which has delivered ammunition to the front and is coming back empty, tries to get around this pandemonium on the remaining free strip of land along the roadside. There are shouts. We must break through. The lorry slowly slides into the ditch and gets stuck there. It is a private lorry adapted for army use, but it does not meet the requirements of the situation. Now there is an unimaginable traffic jam on the road, and this on a road that is being used to supply the army. Everyone is in an uncontrollable rage. Everyone is shouting at each other, sweating, cursing everything in the world. Soiled people begin to get chills. The horses that are covered in mud are foaming at the mouth. But suddenly the rage passes. Someone lights a cigarette. Someone takes the initiative. The lorry is pulled out of the ditch with the help of horses strapped to a single cable. The whole load is pulled out of the wagon with the damaged wheel. There is a general laugh if some absolutely ridiculous thing like a blue quilt or several live geese are found. People walk into puddles so deep that water gets into their boots. They grab a muddy wheel and with cries of "Gotcha! Got it!" they push the empty wagon to the side of the road. The extra horses are harnessed to another wagon and it moves off. The lorry drives round them, honking all the time, and then continues on its way to the ammunition depot in the rear. Such scenes were repeated hundreds of times with monotonous regularity. In a day it was usually possible to cover 12, 6, and sometimes 3 kilometres in this way. At one place several planks were laid side by side, on which it was possible to pass through a ditch. The entire crawling mass of people and vehicles had to make a detour of 20 metres to get around an unexploded bomb lying right in the middle of the road. To the left and right of the road the fields were strewn with all sorts of abandoned things, including cookers, dining tables, beds, radios, empty ammunition boxes, lanterns and the like. The impression is that there has been a flood here. Every few hundred metres there is a broken-down car, a dead horse with a bloated belly, or even someone's corpse. Crows take off, flapping their wings loudly. Cawing grey flocks ceaselessly circle over the living and the dead, over animals and people. Eventually we decide to gallop straight across the field, and in about 2 hours we reach the division headquarters. It was located in a village marked on the map as Cossack Eye and situated in the narrowest part of the isthmus. The chief of the division headquarters was happy to see us. "Thank God you are here. We had been waiting for you for several days." The major explained the situation to us. About 4 kilometres south of us there is a place called Ishun. There was a bridge over the Sheetalek River. This was a key point of Russian defense, and all attempts to seize it by frontal attack ended in failure and with heavy losses. To the west of the bridge flowed a river, which in the steppe was just a small brook. But at the confluence with the sea, it widened to form a swampy delta. The Russians hardly expected to be attacked across the marsh, and as it was probable that their defences were weaker in this section, it was decided to attack just across the marsh. However, this would only be possible when frost hit, which was unlikely any time soon, so it was decided to bridge the gates. It was impossible to open a field surgical hospital near the nearest bank of the Shitulik, as there were no houses and no shelter at all. Kazakh, IE, and Kazakh, IE were the only settlements in the area marked on the maps. Division headquarters had previously stopped at Cossack, I for a short time. By local standards, my dear doctor, said the major, Cossack II is quite a cosy place. The only drawback is that the locals have taken out and hidden all the window frames and hidden all the chickens in the steppe. Therefore, if we are going to do operations here, Cossack I or Cossack IT are best suited for this purpose. I decided to personally inspect both settlements. At the same time, I also had to think about what kind of advanced medical aid post to place near the bank of the Shitulik, near the entrance to the newly paved track through the swamp. I also wanted to find out how the forward units were going to ferry the wounded to the end of the Ghat when they crossed the river. All this would take place on terrain as flat as a pancake and only a few kilometers from the Russian positions. We mounted our horses and set off. We could not find Cossack HE at all, but somewhere in the steppe we came upon a deep hole. Window frames were leaned against its edges and some miserable chickens with wet, ruffled feathers were running about. We managed to catch one of them, but the whole spectacle made such a depressing impression on us that we endeavoured to gallop away as quickly as possible. The village of Kazakh IT consisted of about a dozen huts. One or two of them were occupied by units which gave the impression that they had nothing to do, that no orders had reached them, and that they were just living on their own quietly and unnoticed, while the war was going on all around. Our request that they should vacate the premises they occupied was met with marked displeasure. On the doors of all the huts we wrote PH Field Surgery, in chalk, and at the bottom we inscribed the date and time. Then we galloped off in the direction of Shitulik. The Russian artillery was firing heavily, but fortunately for us there was a thick fog. Near the river a strange sight awaited us. About 100 men were standing there, huddled together in a close heap, though the Russians were only a few kilometers away. I dismounted not far from them, and handed the reins from my horse to Garloff. The sappers had already paved about 600 meters of track. In the midst of this crowd I noticed a medical officer who had set up a first aid station here with only a first aid kit and a few stretchers. All his equipment was lying beside him right in the mud. From him I learnt that 2 companies had already rushed across the swamp and entrenched themselves on the opposite bank, and now they asked for ammunition. He thought the troops would be able to carry the wounded on stretchers no further than where we were now, and only after the construction of the causeway had been completed. So they are lying somewhere, buried in the earth, in the mud that the steppe has become, under a bottomless sky that is being cut up by the shells flying towards them. And it seems to them that they have no choice but to die in silence, without waiting for help. Why don't we launch one of the signal flares used by sailors in distress, so that it flashes over them as a symbol of hope and support? While I was thinking about this tiny spark of hope that would light up the hearts of the doomed people, there was a strange, frightening, foreboding sound in the air. People looked up. No one knew what it was. Suddenly there was a tremendous explosion. About 100 meters away, a huge column of dirt exploded into the air, and then a cloud of smoke rose upwards. We felt the shock wave. Shrapnel flew into the air. People screamed and threw themselves to the ground. Everyone was frightened. We experienced for the first time the effect of a new Russian weapon that fired a simultaneous volley of many heavy mortar barrels. Somewhat later it was dubbed the Stalin organ. Only one man was injured. He was wounded by a piece of shrapnel in his lung. He was laid on one of the stretchers and a medical officer dressed his wound. I told this officer that we were going to open a field surgical hospital at Cossack, by IE. A few hours later this brave man himself was brought to us on a stretcher. During one of the following volleys from the Stalin organ he was wounded in the stomach and died from loss of blood, as his spleen had been damaged. He was given all the necessary help, but it was not possible to save him. The fact that we had a friendly chat with him for at least some time meant that he could die with the knowledge that there would be at least one witness left who could claim that he had fought and won under the invisible flag to the very end. While the engineer unit was bridging the causeway across the swampy mouth of the Shatalik River, by which the division was attempting to outflank the Russian defensive positions at the bridge near Ishuni, Garloff and I rode back to Cossack HE. Where could our medical company be now? Still moving forward, or stuck in a traffic jam on the road somewhere? In any case, as soon as I announced that a field surgical hospital would be opened in Cossack, there was an immediate rush of wounded. News like that travels fast. The wounded will simply be unloaded in front of our post, and all further care of them will fall on our shoulders. I outlined the situation to Garloff and explained to him some of the terrain. 1/3 of successful military service consists of a good knowledge of one's duties. Another third is the presence of common sense, and another third is simply luck. Thus, Frederick the Great once said that he does not take into service officers who do not have luck, and Napoleon believed that luck is just a character trait of a man. Given the circumstances and the peculiarities of the local soil, Garloff's horse-drawn ambulance would be able to operate much more efficiently than ambulances, of which there were only a few three-axle vehicles capable of travelling off-road. Our old mate Captain Stubb was at this time in the neighbourhood of Kherson, where his unit was engaged in building a bridge across the Dnieper, so we could not count on his help. Besides, his huge tractors were such a conspicuous target that the Russians could not resist the temptation to fire on them. The army of 1941 was far less well prepared to deal with the swell than the Grand Army of 1812. Garloff and I drove up a small hill so that I could show him some landmarks by which he could find his way back. There was a shout from somewhere below. "Hey, you, can't you see where you're going?" Right in front of us, dug into the ground and covered by a few tufts of steppe grass, was a stereo telescope. I hung down on my horse's neck to see who was talking to me. "No. Who are you? What are you doing here?" The corporal who was sitting next to the trumpet had evidently come to the conclusion that unknown lunatics riding horses across the surrounding steppes could only serve in the general's staff. Therefore, he clearly reported, "Forward artillery observation post. 3rd Battery." It was one of the batteries of the artillery regiment of our division. "Forward observation post." The Russians are just in front of us. That's the front line. So it was the front line. We probably looked like a pretty comical pair. Asked the grinning corporal to show us the way, rode back with a very unpleasant feeling in our hearts. The fog had cleared, but there was still a slight haze. In any case, nothing irreparable had happened. After all, the third component of successful military service is luck. As we approached Cossack II, we immediately recognized the figure of Captain Rombach, our commander, who had come from far away. He was standing all alone on the southern edge of the village. It was us he was waiting for. We tried to change to a light gallop, but Napoleon and Pani did not obey us. "Where is our medical company at the moment?" "Less than 2 kilometers from here. It arrived half an hour ago." Rombach said it in as resentful a tone as he was capable of. Naturally, he wanted to savour his triumph. Standing here was a feat of heroism, with the company just around the corner, and I didn't even bother to send him a note. It would be wrong to suppose that we thought of nothing else but service, or that we thought of ourselves as the saviours of mankind. In our long years of service, both of us had become accustomed to hiding behind such declarations as a facade. We wanted to live, and we saw our daily existence as a kind of game. I had made a flawless reconnaissance, and now we knew exactly what was in front of us. 2-0 in my favour. Rombach made a spectacular gesture by bringing the company in so quickly. We agreed on the score of 3-2 in his favour. Then he led me, like the host of an estate to his welcome guest, into the house. Something was burning within, and it awakened in me my fondest desires. A fire in the furnace, he took my hand with a feigned tenderness. A tenderness which was nullified by a few caustic remarks. That's the way thorns and thorns hide under a cactus flower. He and I were so far from our nearest and dearest homes. We had spent so much time travelling. We knew so little of what was to come. We had already lost so many acquaintances. Many of them had been wounded. Many had disappeared into the mysterious world of camps and prisons. We gradually began to forget what it was like. The old life? Soldier's life has its own peculiarities, and this leads to the creation of its own customs and codes of law, as well as to such cactus tenderness. Warming is a long process that takes place in several stages. At first it feels like the fire is just burning. Then the hands and face are warmed. Very gradually the heat penetrates deep into the body, and finally the extremities are warmed. The heat penetrates there along with the blood. We had a blissful hour of rest ahead of us. Once we start operating, we will have to work almost without rest, maybe for 3 days, maybe for 3 weeks. But until our company got here and the field surgical hospital had not yet opened, we didn't have much to do. Fortunately, the divisional Protestant chaplain reached us. We received him with all possible hospitality in our untidy house, and he was extremely grateful to us for it. It was highly probable that he would be provided with employment. In the army, the Protestant chaplain was called Esek, and the Catholic priest Kosek, abbreviations for Protestant anti-sin canon and Catholic anti-sin canon. It was a friendly joke, and without further ado, Kosek II was renamed SAKU in. Rombach solved the transport problem by getting rid of half of the wagons, and distributed the freed horses among the remaining ones so that it was now possible to harness 4 or even 6 horses per wagon. Of course, with 6 horses, these light wagons travelled quite fast, though their wheels broke quite often. He accommodated us exactly as I had asked him to. This friendly consensus gave us a special pleasure. The Holy Father told us incredible stories about the Crimea. In the Yala Mountains, in a place with the memorable and beautiful name of Bek Kizere, there is still a palace, built mostly of wood, where the Tatar Khans lived. Only 2 such palaces have survived in the whole world. The other is located on the southern slopes of the Caucasus Mountains and rises above Tiflis. In Crimea, there is also a Karaite citadel in Chufut Kale, built by the Khazars, who converted to Judaism as early as the 8th century and who possessed important Jewish books. The Khazars, I heard something about them during my last year of school, and now we will have the opportunity to see all these sites in person. On the south coast of Crimea, the Russian Riviera, palace after palace, villa after villa, rise among the palm trees. There were rumours that a real road had been built between Simferopol and Sevastopol. That's when I first heard about Sevastopol. For many months it hung over us like a sword of Damocles. But at that moment the decision whether it belonged to us or to the Russians, who had decided to spend the winter in the Crimea, still depended on the outcome of the battle for the swampy mouth of the Chetelik River. 20 wounded had already been taken to the field surgical hospital, and Sergeant Herman came out to report that we were ready to begin operating. One of our first patients turned out to be Capital Ostroslov. He had been shot in both buttocks, but was able to make it to us by his own power. We've often seen cases like this. The excitement of combat dulls the pain for a while. Sometimes it does not begin to be felt until hours later. As the patient entered the operating theatre with his light-hearted comments, the thought flashed through my mind that such a wound was quite fitting for this clown. But the capital sharpener, though he never stopped making his jokes, was no longer a clown. He commanded one of the 2 companies that first crossed the swamp. But, Doctor, it was the only way out. We were sitting targets. The Russians were sitting in a trench. After every volley we had wounded, so we regrouped and moved on them. We could have been decorated or we could have been court-martialed. We had no idea what awaited us. If we had boots, we could go in sideways, such a little entertaining excursion. His wound was one of those problems whose solution is not described in textbooks. The bullet must have lodged parts of his clothing in the body. Theoretically, this could lead to gas gangrene, and the deeper the wound, the more likely it is to occur, so the bullet entry wound must be properly cleaned. But that means turning a relatively minor combat wound into a deep surgical incision. Our own experience told us that, contrary to theory, such wounds heal without much complication. So we treated the wound of the Capital Ostroslov with a large dose of iodine and sealed it with 2 strips of plaster. From the information given to us by the wounded, we could trace the course of the operation in every detail. The sudden, unprecedented deterioration of conditions creates a quiet rage in people. In every account there is respect, mixed with feigned indignation, for the resilience of the enemy. They all stayed out of battle for more than a week, and were out in the open all day and night. You can't fail to mention that. They had all forgotten that they had once been labourers, peasants, traders. That was a long time ago. They have all become exceptionally experienced fighters. They have replaced sentiment with cold practicality. The Russian wounded also showed insensitivity to pain if they were shown friendliness. They were also possessed by a deafening rage. The war had really only just begun. We had also lost our sense of reality. Common sense, of course, kept us from acting rashly, but it was no more than a pale shadow at the back of our minds. The Napoleonic ruthless mistress, the coincidence of circumstances, ruled the ball in the delta of the Cheta. If the worst happened and the Russians went on the counterattack, they would overpower us within hours. It was unlikely that we would be helped by the terrain conditions. Only much later did I learn that one of the companies had carefully tended the Russian wounded, it had managed to capture, and then evacuated them when the threat had passed. The war seemed to have lost all connection with the cause that had prompted it. It had become a war to total victory. The causeway was completed, and the first wounded from the other side began to arrive. Junior Lieutenant Joachim, who commanded the motorized medical company, that is, the other medical company of our division, personally arrived in a 3-axle ambulance and began to collect the wounded and bring them during a pause while one patient was being removed from the operating table and another was just being prepped for surgery. The two of us had a cup of coffee while sitting down on a crate. Joachim told me that the sappers at the entrance to the hall had asked him to bring rifle cartridges and hand grenades with him on the way back. But he had refused because he was travelling under the Red Cross emblem. But the Russians fired machine guns at his ambulance, and on his next trip he covered a white circle with mud, with a red cross painted on the background. We then learned from one of the wounded sappers that the troops had bypassed the swampy delta by boat along the navigable section. In this way it was possible to capture and hold the bridgehead and even to make an advance towards Ishuni. Many hundreds of wounded passed through our hands during these 2 days and nights. With such an influx we had never before encountered. The division medical chief sent another surgeon to assist us, together with his own operating team, so that from time to time we were able to take a break. However, the flow of wounded was so great that we still had no opportunity to sleep during these short intervals. During this time we had at least a dozen air raids, but the huts we occupied were so small that the shock wave was not terrible for them. They could only be damaged by a direct hit of a bomb. Some horses were killed by bomb fragments. Our general practitioner was ordered to remove the patients. All the wounded who could be transported and who did not need constant observation were immediately sent to the field hospital located in Armyansk. At times we had to leave 4 to 8 wounded lying in the open air for some time. The ambulances had to be unloaded immediately. The huts were filled to overflowing with wounded. Garloff raced the horses to the utmost of their ability. Eventually he made an arrangement with Lieutenant Joachim and travelled to the other side of the causeway in his wagon, as there was less chance of a bomb or shell hitting it, to carry the wounded from the regimental forward first aid post and bring them to the very beginning of the causeway. For a while we were getting patients wounded only by rifle fire or grenade fragments. The Russians began to withdraw their artillery to the rear. Then we received our first wounded man, who had come straight from Ishuni. Sergeant Meyer carried him in his arms. The bridge was captured by a neighbouring division. Soon after that it was all over. The rumble of the guns subsided. The air raids stopped. The wounded stopped arriving. There was an unusual silence. The war moved on, and we were left behind. And with us a few unfortunate steppe villages whose names were inscribed in the history of the war in blood. I will not be surprised if after a while hardly anyone will remember these names at all, as well as the names of the Sarmatians and Scythians who fought and died here 2,000 years before the events described, and now they are all laid to rest in the ground. A whole cemetery had grown up on the outskirts of the village. In our emergency room there were all sorts of small things left by the dead. A mirror, a wallet, photographs of a little chubby boy or a house on the shore of one of the lakes in the vicinity of Berlin, sometimes a watch, and sometimes a few banks stained with blood. The 2nd Brigade of Surgeons left us. It was transferred to Ishun. Suddenly the permanent inhabitants of the village returned to it again. None of us realized where they'd been hiding all this time. Throughout the night we performed surgeries on the remaining wounded. As soon as we finished operating on the last of them, a soldier was brought in with a completely mangled face. However, a detailed examination showed that, fortunately, neither the eyes nor the bones had been significantly damaged, only a small part of the soft tissue had been lost. I proceeded with the facial surgery. Such an operation was supposed to be performed under local anesthesia, or, to be more precise, it was necessary to paralyze a special group of nerves. If general anesthesia was used, there was a good chance that blood would enter the patient's lungs, which could lead to pneumonia. The chaplain sat nearby and observed the operation. In a friendly, bantering discussion, we discussed the comparative merits of spiritual knowledge and the advances of natural science. Even our surgical team had never performed this kind of plastic surgery before. It is time-consuming if you wish to restore facial features with anatomical precision, and only the highest quality threads should be used. Gradually, the mutilated face acquires its usual features, good-natured face of a peasant. The operation has reached its final phase. I sewed up one of the corners of the patient's mouth. Then we sat him in a chair. I said, "It's okay, try to say something." Since the local anesthetic had not yet worn off, he could not feel any pain. He moved his lips gently, and then with a barely perceptible smile, he almost silently said just one word. "No, thank you." Winter came. Near Sevastopol there were position battles. We were stationed in a place called Dudjukarilis, a Tatar village in one of the narrow valleys of the Yala Mountains. This valley stretched at right angles towards the Russian positions, reinforced in this section by batteries of heavy artillery, and the village lurked on one of the slopes of this valley, so close to the enemy's positions that it saved us from shelling. Owing to the lack of accommodation at Juhari Karalis, only the attendants of the field surgical hospital were housed there. The rest of the company, including warehouses and heavy equipment, was located in another village near the road leading to Simferopol. It must be said that it was a real road. Only a year ago, buses belonging to Intourist, the Soviet tourism organization, used to drive along it. When we drove along it to the rear, we had to pass one section, about a quarter of a kilometre long, at which all conversation stopped by itself. The fact was that it was under enemy fire. The Russians were shelling the vehicles passing along the road. For this purpose, they used heavy guns placed in two armoured turrets called Maxim Gorky I and Maxim Gorky DE. Many of our soldiers then heard the name of this great writer for the first time. Tatar houses differed greatly from Ukrainian mazanoks in their construction. They were wooden and very unusual in appearance. Bakhchizere, the old capital of the Crimean Khanate, there were Khan's palaces, minarets, 127 fountains. Houses in Juhari Karalis usually consisted of 2 rooms. Our people occupied one of them, while the Tatar families continued to live in the other. The Tatars, who have always been considered a warlike people, immediately welcomed our troops. Centuries they had been at enmity with Moscow, so we made fast friends with them. They had nuts and tobacco. We had bread and vodka. Besides, they had one thing, which for us seemed to be an object of incredible luxury. Large, round copper basins 2 meters in diameter and up to half a meter deep. We used them for bathing, but our people found out with some bewilderment that at the very moment when they were going to bathe, the mother of a Tatar family could appear and offer to wash their backs. In addition to these basins, the Tatars possessed some other copper items, some of which were very ancient. Copper was mined in mines near Kerch, which is where the ancient Greek city of Pantikapaeum was located. There was no furniture in the Tatar dwellings, only low benches along all 4 walls. We sat on them during the day and slept at night. Terrifying news came from the central and northern sections of the Eastern Front, but it made little impression on us. We had plenty of worries of our own, although the winter in the south was not a real Russian winter. Down the southern coast of the Crimea, snow falls very rarely. In the mountains to the north of them, the winter is very much like the winter in Germany. At first, the hospital was housed in Shuli. It was a medium-sized village at the entrance to the valley, which was constantly under fire from Russian artillery. We conducted operations in the local school building. Every day, there were 3 or 4 massive bombardments. The operating table was in the part of the building that faced the enemy. Placing us in this location was foolish from both a military and practical point of view. Although at this time most units were still commanded by officers with World War I experience under their belt, it seemed that mysteriously they had completely forgotten what trench warfare was all about. It was high time to start building dugouts. This had previously been given great importance, because in them the wounded could be at least relatively safe. However, nothing of the kind had been done. From the medical point of view, it was pure madness that the seriously wounded we had to operate on were then forced to lie under fire for several more days. When a soldier is wounded, he wants to be as far away from the line of fire as possible, and he holds on with his last strength. Just try to imagine a man lying on a carpet, helpless, unable to move on his own, expecting to be hit by another volley any minute, barely recovered from the effects of anesthesia, weakened, with low blood pressure, Our patients again fell into a state of collapse. Prolonged anxiety leads to contraction of the smallest blood vessels and to disruption of intestinal activity. A sudden fright leads to the release of adrenaline into the blood. Sometimes it is not possible to bring the person back to normal. We have lost quite a few patients who, under other circumstances, might well have been saved. The number of graves in the cemetery opposite the school was growing at an alarming rate. Just at this time, a captain was brought to me who had been wounded by a tiny fragment of a mine. It had hit him just under the base of his ribs on the left side, and it was difficult to determine whether it had penetrated the abdomen or the chest. Apart from a small mass in the upper left side of the abdomen, I could feel nothing else, but it could have been caused by damage to the diaphragm. All this was not very encouraging, and besides, the patient immediately asked me how long he had left to live. From a surgical point of view, it would be correct to do a laparotomy, to open the abdomen and make a diagnosis after direct examination. If it turns out that the intestines or one of the large blood vessels is damaged, you have to operate. If it turns out that there is nothing serious, you can just sew up the incision. Of course, this is quite a complicated operation, but it does not pose any serious threat to the patient's life. However, if the surgeon does not perform such an operation and the patient ends up with internal organ damage, he or she will inevitably die. I knew from past experience that in controversial cases it was better not to take hasty steps and wait for further developments. Although, to be sure, I always consulted my colleague, a very experienced doctor, who examined the wounded extremely carefully so that I could then operate on them without any fear of their condition deteriorating. In this case, however, it was extremely dangerous to open the abdomen simply for the purpose of diagnosis. The patient could not be required to remain under fire for days after such an operation, especially since the man himself was convinced that he had a better chance of dying than of surviving. It only took an hour to get him by ambulance to the field hospital, which is why I decided to send the captain there. Even though he was in a lot of pain, I didn't give him a shot of morphine, for if he really had an abdominal wound, the pain would be an important factor in helping another surgeon make a correct diagnosis. At noon, the news reached us that the captain had died during the journey. As he was in severe pain, he asked the ambulance driver to make stops from time to time, so the journey dragged on for almost 2 hours. The company commander told me that the division medical chief intended to investigate the case, so I outlined the case to Rombach. He had once taken a special course in forensic medicine and was able to convince the division medical chief that refusal to operate should not be regarded as neglect of duty on the part of the surgeon if the cause of death was not established by autopsy. For some reasons which I was never able to find out, no autopsy was performed on the corpse. But all this was of little concern to me. Most likely the cause of death was damage to the spleen. No doubt the captain would still be alive if I had operated on him at once. I was responsible for his death. The next day, surgeons are allowed to rest for 24 hours after their shift. I went to regimental headquarters to meet Colonel Reinhardt. He met me with all the cordiality of an old friend. He already knew the nature of the case and endeavoured to reassure me. I fully shared his indignation at the fact that the surgical field hospital continued to remain in Shuli. He could see the village from his command post and often thought of us the moment he saw shells flying in our direction. I asked him if it would not be considered cowardice if we moved to a safer place. He laughed, patted me on the shoulder, and said, "Nutty, put all that heroic nonsense out of your head. You've been through all this already. You have a completely different task. I will discuss this matter with the division commander." We went up to the observation post of the regiment. Colonel Reinhardt showed me Sevastopol through a stereo tube. We could just make out a few tall houses on the crest of the hill. In the light of the setting sun, they seemed to be shrouded in a light haze. Since we had no official permission to relocate the surgical field hospital, we decided to do so at our own risk. Rombach found the village of Juhari Karales. It took about half an hour to reach it from Shuli along a narrow mountain path, which was not easy because of the mud, but was nevertheless quite passable. On the pretext of moving a few of our vehicles, we moved the surgeon and the entire surgical team to Juhari Karales. All serious operations began to be carried out there. In Shuli, we now only treated walking wounded. A week later, we were visited by a surgeon, a consultant from the headquarters of the army group. He immediately realized how inconvenient our positions were and gave permission to transfer the whole unit to Juhari Karales. However, the feeling of relief that we had moved from the danger zone to a quieter place was once again short-lived, because the general situation was threatening. With great difficulty, the Russians again managed to capture the eastern part of Crimea, the Kerch Peninsula. The Russian landing force landed in the harbour of Feodosia, southern coast of Crimea. As it turned out, fishermen from Feodosia, who had received written permission from the local army command to fish in the bay, showed them the passages through the minefields. After the capture of the city, the Russians threw the wounded from the local hospital into the street and then doused them with water. I always listened to such stories with great disbelief. It was known that the others had a special department in which they specially invented such horrible stories. But in this case, the Russians managed to do something that I had never heard before, even in the most terrible stories. They were witnesses who miraculously survived. The troops tried to prevent the penetration into the territory we occupied by mobile groups of the enemy. It was then that many people first heard the ominous word partisan. Eventually, the Russians also landed in the harbour of Yevpatoria, on the western coast of the Crimea. When news of this reached Army Group headquarters late in the afternoon, its commander called a meeting. We had no more available reserves. The siege of Sevastopol was hanging by a thread. We discussed all the options. No one really knew what to do. During the meeting, the Colonel General turned to the youngest of the staff officers, a major who had just been transferred here from the General Staff. "Fabricius, you are the last of us to graduate from the General Staff Academy. What do you think of the current situation?" Major replied, "The General Staff Academy has never dealt with such situations." The commander looked round at all the staff officers. "Gentlemen," said the Colonel General, "if no one has any ideas, then the most sensible in such a situation seems to go to bed." Well, at any rate, he had strong nerves. Meanwhile, a small reconnaissance detachment had received orders to attack the Russians at Yevpatoria. Led by their commander, a handful of men fell upon the Russians with such fury that panic arose among the enemy troops, and they stopped the landing. The Russian vessels withdrew from the shore. Those units that had already managed to land surrendered as prisoners. The commander of the German detachment was killed by a cue from a Russian machine gun. On 24 December, a regrouping of our forces was made. Parts that were occupied near Sevastopol for some time were transferred to the eastern part of the peninsula to repel the Russian offensive there. We were able to hold the Crimea in our hands during that winter. On Christmas morning, Colonel Reinhardt, soaked to the skin and covered with mud, arrived in our village with his entire staff, and we invited him to breakfast. We ate right on the operating table. We simply had no other table. During these months, many of us first became acquainted with the unpleasant feeling in the lower abdomen. Later, it became very familiar to us in various cauldrons and on bridgeheads. Previously, we had always been in a good mood. In the morning, after a good night's rest in the sunshine, or at midday, after a cup of coffee. But now we were suddenly thinking about the unknown future looming on the horizon. The army was trying to shake off its sense of despair by striking hard in all directions. And it was succeeding once more. At that time, we were concerned with one very pressing problem, which is not described in any medical book or reflected in the manuals. All the blankets, all our hospital blankets gradually disappeared. I can still describe in great detail the room in Johari Corrales where the wounded lay. It probably used to be a gymnasium. On the right side were the wounded who were being treated. On the left were free places for new arrivals. All were lying on carpets spread on the floor. In spite of all the diligence of our exceptionally experienced corporals, we managed to warm up this room only once, when we lit the candles on the Christmas tree. Hot tea was served to all comers without delay, and each wounded man received 2 or even 3 blankets. However, blankets soon became a great shortage. We often sent the wounded by ambulance directly to the airfield located in Cerebas. It was dangerous to evacuate them by railway via Kherson, as several trains had previously been attacked. Eventually, the Air Force Command agreed to provide us with transport aircraft for evacuating the wounded, which returned empty to Bolshaya Zemlya. It must be said that during the war, it was the Air Force that showed the greatest willingness to help the wounded. Most aeroplanes flew as far as Bucharest, where there were excellent hospitals. It probably seemed almost miraculous to the wounded when, after only a few hours, instead of a cold gymnasium, he suddenly found himself in a warm bed under the care of caring nurses. This method of evacuation was not officially authorized. Transport aircraft were not specially adapted for sanitary needs. We had to provide extra blankets for the wounded, and because this method of transport was unofficial, we did not get them back. Eventually, we were left without blankets at all. We sent our superiors one alarming message after another, but constantly received the standard reply: units must make do with the amount of material resources they have been assigned. One day, two corporals, Schurz and Votruba, came to us with the suggestion that they would fly to Bucharest to replenish our supply of blankets. Schurz was an experienced, much-seen man, having served for many years as a chef on transatlantic liners. Votruba was a Hoover salesman. This brilliant idea allowed them, at least for a while, to take their minds off the monotonous routine of positional warfare. It was clear from the start that it was their own idea, and they were just the right people for the job. We were able to make a whole collection of passes of all kinds ourselves, and in addition we gave them several hundred packets of cigarettes to take with them. With these, it was easiest to get people to favour us and get them to help. Then among the wounded we selected an elderly senior sergeant and initiated him into the matter. He agreed to play the part of a man supposedly suffering from a life-threatening wound who was to be accompanied by two orderlies. In fact, he had only a slight wound in his thigh. The whole trio flew to Bucharest. A week later, our two travellers arrived back at Johari Karalis. They drank a large number of cocktails in the bars of Bucharest. In between they found their girlfriends, whom they had met back in 1940 when the division was training in Romania, but they delivered 2 aeroplanes stuffed to the top with blankets. The first thing they did was go to the chief of the Air Force Hospital. He was sympathetic to their request and provided the necessary number of blankets. They then bribed the lorry driver with cigarettes. He delivered the blankets to the aerodrome. They then went to the aerodrome manager and asked him to provide them with an aeroplane. It is not surprising that he simply turned them away, but they were persistent and approached him a second time. This time he asked them to show their documents. They could be arrested at any moment for unauthorized departure. The aerodrome manager did not have much confidence in the documents we produced. But, said Votruba, we told him a beautiful story, and then we tried to make him feel sorry for us, the wounded lying in the snow, and so on. I even managed to squeeze out 1 or 2 tears. In the end, the airfield manager laughed and gave them 2 aeroplanes. This story became well known. We were often paid courtesy visits by the commanders of neighbouring medical units. Naturally, we portrayed complete incomprehension. But since the hospital did not need so many blankets, the surplus was given to the neighbours. In the end, Rumbach and I concocted a beautiful story according to which any 2 knaves could go to Bucharest for cocktails under a plausible pretext.